how many are engaged in doing something to cut off this crisis, right? Or are we making, we presupposing to know what a homeless person looks like, sounds like, who would be homeless. So what myths do you think might still be brewing that keep this a silent crisis waiting to happen?
Well, I think that I could break that down into a couple of parts because some of the myths are that homelessness does have a certain look, that it does mean that you are visually outside and that you are laying under the bridge and that you are unkept and you are you know unbathed and so on and so forth. That is a myth that helps perpetuate it. And then there is the fact that women, these particular women, this group of women, they are managing the perception of homelessness by faking that they are okay. And while we're here, I want to park here just for a moment because there's a delightful book that I have stumbled upon. It is titled 55 Unemployed and Faking Normal by Elizabeth White. Her story is phenomenal, one in which I'm not sure that we have the time to cover. But in fact, I hope that we could one day have her on the podcast, I hope. But the phenomenal story speaks very succinctly to what we are talking about today. Highly educated and accomplished Black woman. Her title of her book, 55 Unemployed and Faking It, Elizabeth White. So I want to not only mention that, but offer that as a resource because that feeds into what stigmas are perpetuating this idea of what homelessness looks like. Like I said, this woman had latte in hand, right? So visually, she's okay, but the truth is she is not. And so I think that we want to get our arms around this. I think individually, as individuals, I think at the corporate complex, we somehow need to get our arms around this before this becomes a larger part of the issue that we already have with homelessness. And the reason why I'm so sensitive to it, one, because I am impacted, one, by COVID, job loss, but then the other thing is this is my demographic. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think part of why people are so overwhelmed by the idea of homelessness is because it has so many moving parts. It's a ginormous issue, and we just don't know where to begin. I have decided that this is because it's come into my personal space. I've met these women. I know these women. I've recruited one of these women. So I think that this is somewhat destined to be the chunk or the piece of this conundrum that I take on by way of this podcast, asking people to help join in. There are, when I think of how and what initiatives, how can we address this? Now, this is broad, but there is Queen Latifah has, by way of Blue Sugar Corporation, she has an initiative where she has developed or contributed to a $1.4 million affordable housing initiative. I think that is the type of thing that we can get behind, or corporations can get behind, and we just make ourselves more aware and then decide if this is something that we want to get alongside. And so, Jasmine, and I hope I answered your question. Did I answer your question? Or
absolutely, because and I had asked the question about the myths because what we believe about a matter is very likely going to dictate our engagement with the matter. And I'm just wondering if you were seeing something similar, that because we have these preconceived notions about homelessness and what a homeless person looks like,
right,
that we may be overlooking a demographic that is suffering just like others who are experiencing homelessness.
I agree.
This idea of using today to bring awareness to, you laid it out really nicely. Homelessness is multifaceted, it's multi-pronged, right? It impacts, it's cross-cutting. And I think what you've made clear today is that, yes, it cuts across through to people who we may not have said, oh, somebody who's wearing nice clothes, driving a nice car, they don't fit the profile, and being able to use this platform to debunk that.
That's right.
And in a post-COVID world, there are many who are a paycheck away from this conversation.
That's
and
right.
As soon as we say a paycheck away, you also raised, hey, here's what individuals can do about this to get and educate yourself and get involved. And then from a larger scale change, organizations, companies, what role could they play, right? That becomes a question as well. So from corporate sort of social responsibility,
yes,
or even HR practices, what are your thoughts around, say, even our HR practices, right, in this demographic? Because there's a strong link between income, may come from a job, and being able to afford to pay for housing. At the root of that is somebody's got to be hired and kept on a payroll, or starting their own business. But if we talk just about organizations, what are your thoughts about how do our HR practices even help us to ward off this very crisis that we're discussing?
Right. And so, because I believe that we're hard pressed to explain why industrious, educated, young 50-something-year-old women are finding themselves jobless and consequently homeless. Like, that's just hard to justify. And I think it's an even harder conversation to have, that there are behaviors in the workplace that are perpetuating this outcome. It's a hard conversation to have. And back to the one woman asking me, do you think because I was out on leave and I came back that I am now a burden on the healthcare cost for the company? That's a hard conversation to have. So again, I say that if, organizations are to be sensitive to this kind of thing, maybe you need to look at your internal practices, policies, and behaviors. Maybe they are not necessarily above board when it comes to this demographic of women. Because listen, again, I can't emphasize enough, the stigma is real. The hidden homelessness is a thing, and it is about to implode. And it's unfortunate because the embarrassment that these women experience, the stigma, is causing them to perpetuate this thing that, homeless is not a look. It's not a look. It is a thing.
Yeah.
So, they're couch surfing, they're living in cars by force. And so unable to maintain housing tenure because of pay inequality, joblessness, and consequently housing insecurity. So finances are a means to housing. And this is pre and post COVID. And I think the bigger picture is when we've been talking about inequality pay for women for how long now? But what no one is focusing on is the consequence. One of the consequences being these women are finding themselves housing insecure, hence homeless as a result, because we block that part out. we're not thinking about that part because it's too hard to think about, but we have to get our arms around it. And I think more than anything, that's what I want people to understand about this. And it's nothing to run from. We have to run towards it.
And that's a good lead in to one of the other questions that I had. Many people, we see the big problems, right? And we go, it's just too big. That's just the way it is, and
Right.
shall be into perpetuity. And if let's say that's not true, that there's something that either on the individual level, at the larger scale or larger organization level, as an individual, if somebody said, tell me one thing, if I was going to do one thing to educate myself and to get myself plugged in to start to make a positive difference for individuals, what baby step could an individual take to have a positive income on or outcome on this income situation?
This income situation, in fact. And I think it's the same, it's what I'm doing. It's this conversation. It's given voice to this issue. I think that an individual can take a piece of this by becoming aware of what's happening and to ascribe to a cause, even if it's just the awareness, becoming aware, and then finding out, how do I take a chunk of this and become a part of the solution? Because that's the thing. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. But to take a chunk of it, a piece of it, and then become a part of the bigger remedy, is what I would suggest, because that's all I'm doing by giving voice by way of this podcast. And truly, I would love to have a bigger part to play. I hope to have a bigger part to play. But even if it's just this, it's something that we can do to speak to the issue. But doing nothing is definitely not an option.
Not an option. So that brings up another point. I love that that adage of doing nothing is not an option, because when we look at organizations who and where we are today, where we have landed, whether it's social unrest and just a myriad of things that are going on in the culture, adding this to that mosaic of things that we'd like to see better. Mm-hmm. So organizations, for their part, we touched on this idea earlier of corporate social responsibility. Mm-hmm. And you even mentioned some work that Queen Latifah and others like her are doing.
Yes.
If a corporation were to call you today to say, I'm in, I want to be responsible, what advice would you have for the corporate representative that says, how can I help?
Well, that's big because For one, I would suggest